What's much harder and what's much more rare is the kind of introspection that says, how do we critique our own communities and say, how have we contributed to an environment that creates hostility?
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer of The Bulletin. Today on the show, hosts Bob Smetana, Mike Cosper, and Nicole Martin discuss white rural rage. Is small-town America really angry? And what can be done about it? Mike Waddy, former pastor of the smallest incorporated town in Tennessee, that's right, just 88 people, joins the conversation to talk about the challenges and joys of rural life. Next, it's off to the races for a conversation about sports betting. Who's doing it, how much money is changing hands, and why the church doesn't talk about gambling. Finally, I stopped by the studio to talk with Mike and Dr. Chris Bauman about the current status of the Israel-Gaza war. Dr. Bauman is the former Trump administration director for Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Egyptian affairs with the National Security Council. I learned a lot from talking with them. I'm sure you will too. Now, on to today's show.
Well, hi, Mike and Pastor Mike and Nicole. Glad to be here with you all to talk about a simple and easy topic, rural America. So there's a new book out from journalist Paul Waldman and political scientist Tom Show that says rural America has gone to hell with few jobs, a shrinking population, and failing institutions. As a result, these authors say rural Americans are angry, and they're taking the anger out on the rest of us by voting for Donald Trump and making us all miserable. Their new book, White Rural Rage, has become a New York Times bestseller and has earned both praise and outrage. Fans say it's about time someone took rural America to task, while critics, including rural scholars, say the book got it all wrong. One thing is certain, it's got people talking about rural America. So I'd like to start with a question for Pastor Mike, who's a pastor in rural Tennessee. So is your community filled with rage and a threat for democracy?
No, I don't know that I can speak for every rural community anywhere, everywhere. But, for us, we constitute 1.1 square miles. We're 45% white. We're 33% Hispanic. And we are 21% black, and that little tiny sliver called other. So we all have to get along in 1.1 square mile. There's not a lot of room for a lot of hate. That hasn't always been the case. I think everybody in our little community would freely admit that it hasn't always been the case, but in 2024, on this day, we get along pretty well.
So one of the questions that comes up is that institutions are failing, right? And I wonder if that's been the case in your town. Are the schools in trouble, the businesses, and churches then have to take on a bigger role? So is your church really serving as an anchor in that town, or the other churches?
I would say the little town that I moved here from, that is very much the case. The only institution that was functioning in that little town was the churches, not just the church that I serve, but the other churches in the town as well.
Mike, can you tell us a little bit about the town? Like, where are you located? What's the town like? What's the economy like? Who are the people that you're serving as a pastor?
Well, we are in Crockett County, Tennessee, which is just about 35 minutes north and west of Jackson, Tennessee, if you're familiar with that I-40 corridor. Memphis would be the largest town within driving distance. Our economy is agriculture, has been, is, and that is changing, that is evolving.
I mean, one thing that makes this a White Rural Rage book so interesting is it is one more book trying to explain where Donald Trump came from and who can we blame for it? Who's the problem? And why won't he go away? And so in this case, it's rural America. Rural Americans are angry and racist and terrible, but they have a great scene in that book. It starts out with the Jason Aldean song, Try That in a Small Town. And there's a video for that song that's filmed in Columbia, Tennessee, which is in Maury County, which is just about an hour south of Nashville. So it's in the Nashville metro area. But really the hotbed of anger during the last few years is not in Maury County, Tennessee. It's in Williamson County, Tennessee, the richest county in the state, where they had fights at school boards. We've had Nazis marching in the street. We had real rage because people there feel like they're losing power. And I wonder if maybe we could have a broader conversation about Are we missing the kind of rage of suburban Christians who have something to lose and have ability to affect elections?
One of the most interesting critiques of the book was in The Atlantic over the weekend. A scholar by the name of Tyler Austin Harper took a look at it. And there's a growing consensus from a number of social scientists who've read the book and have basically said, you've got this core problem throughout the book of a lack of definition of what they mean by rural America. And so basically, Harper said in an interview with Chris Steyerwalt, he said it seemed like anytime they found a study that indicated a certain population as the source of this rage that they were looking for, this sort of pro-Trump rage, a rage with a propensity for violence, they would pull that study and then they would use that for that section of the book. That would be their definition of what was rural. But when you actually start to map the things out, very quickly you realize, well, some of these are suburban communities. Some of these are kind of urban communities. They're literally within a metroplex, within the metro city limits of different places. And rural communities just aren't even necessarily that involved. I mean, one of the things he said as well in this interview with Steyerwalt is he said when you actually look at rural communities, they often have a sense of community, togetherness, purpose that means that they're not as obsessed with politics as suburbanites might be, where they are more disconnected, where they are watching more TV and consuming more cable news and cable media and that sort of thing, where politics is more of a form of entertainment than it necessarily is in a rural context. I think it's fascinating that, again, you have one more attempt to kind of define the population that you say, well, these are the people we can blame for not just Trump, but really a big thrust of the book is the source of right-wing violence, the January 6th kind of violence, and a kind of fearful anticipation of the kind of violence that could potentially happen with the 2024 election.
So I am kind of wrestling with this idea of how Americans put hierarchies on levels of rage, and that some rage is dignified with research and books and understood as voting patterns, and other rage is disqualified as that's what those people do. So when there's a protest in an urban setting where they cannot get fresh vegetables and they cannot get a grocery store and they cannot get the resources, that's considered, absolutely awful because those people need to get themselves together. But when it's white and rural, then it's worthy of further discussion and research. Now, I know that what I'm thinking and saying is a controversial thing, but it does feel like only in America can you kind of justify some rage and demonize other rage, and that somehow I can't fight the feeling that there's got to be a place where rage to a certain extent is justified because of the situation. But I'm also wrestling with American culture in general. Who's allowed to be angry? And what are the reasons why we allow for anger to happen?
I think sometimes we tend to look at rage, and I agree with you, Nicole, that we tend to say, all right, that rage is okay, that rage is not okay. I wonder sometimes if we are all tapping into a sense of rage that is manufactured, not that we don't feel it, but that is being stoked as we are being divided. Even the title of the book, I listened to a podcast this morning from the two authors. Their publisher settled on the title of that book. And even the title of the book is inflammatory. And so if we're going to ever get to a real discussion about why people feel the way they feel, then maybe we shouldn't create titles for the books that we are going to use to try to get to the heart of the matter that automatically push people in a certain direction. I think sometimes we stoke rage when maybe we should just be sitting across the table from each other.
I think so much of it has to do with the media environment that you're immersed in as well. Because, for instance, I can remember in 2020 during the George Floyd protests, there were articles, there was an infamous interview on NPR where someone came on and said, looting is a valid form of, social protest. This is righteous rage, looting is okay, blah, blah, blah. And of course, people went crazy over all of that. But it's that kind of argument. This is justified rage, and so we should allow for it. You fast forward 2 years, and the same hosts on Fox News who were losing their minds, telling the story of how NPR was running the story about looting being a form of valid protest, they were justifying the January 6th riot and saying, well, this is valid expression. This is righteous rage. These people think the election is stolen. We have to do it. And so I think part of the missing element in a lot of this is, when it comes to the media environment, is we don't want to tell the hard truths to our own side. What we do want is we want a scapegoat. And so if we can find a scapegoat in rural America or in Black America or in the academy, I mean, that's one of the things you see right now as well. Like on college campuses, you're seeing these protests, you're seeing them get aggressive and get violent at times. And this is righteous rage. You know, you'll hear people saying this is righteous rage. This is a justifiable argument. And what we end up looking for is, well, where's the scapegoat? Who do we get to blame? And what's much harder and what's much more rare is the kind of introspection that says, how do we critique our own communities and say, how have we contributed to an environment that creates hostility? One of the words that is prominent in the book, I heard that same interview, Mike, and I think what he said is that what they wanted to title the book was White Rural Resentment. And that was too many syllables. It wasn't, it wasn't marketable. But like when you think about the way voting patterns are driven, when you think about some of the animating energy behind Trumpism at times, resentment makes a whole lot more sense to me than rage.
If you look at the polling, you have white Christians in the Republican Party, you have everybody else in the other party. Not completely, but it's pretty close to that. And you have church folks becoming partisans in this, right? We have to stop the other side. We have to do this stuff. And what if churches or Christian leaders had just given up on that idea that we could all be in the same country? We want to coexist. I mean, one of the things this book that Right Rural Rage says is you're voting for the wrong people. Stop it. What's wrong with you? Instead of saying, oh, wait, we have to live with these other folks. Because no matter who wins this election this fall, we're all going to be in the same country still. And is there a place for religious folks or church leaders to say, hey, maybe we have to think about the long term, how we're going to all coexist? And I don't hear much of that.
We've traditionally thought the role that faith plays is by standing in the middle, not one or the other. But, you know, like I've heard the constant refrain, we are not for the donkey or the elephant, but for the lamb. Okay, that's nice. And like, what in the world does that look like? So I do think this is the challenging question. And it does bring me back to what is a valid kind of communal sense of patriotism that leads me to embrace the other and not reject it.
I will say this, our town council reflects fairly well the makeup of our community. A few years ago, one of the council members wanted to recognize 5 Black brothers who all went to war in 1991, the first Gulf War. And it was the first time that 5 brothers were all in the same theater of war since the Sullivan brothers in World War II. And so this councilman said, why don't we put a monument to what they did and what they accomplished in our city park? And not only to celebrate what they did, but also the sacrifice that their mother gave in sending 5 young men. And I think sometimes the answer is a lot easier than we try to make it to be. Sometimes it's just about honoring people for what they have accomplished and what they have done, and publicly doing that in such a way that the community is brought together. I live right down the street from that monument. On any given day, on a nice day, you'll see people stopping and looking at that monument. It has become a source of pride for our entire community. We have to give people room to grow, and we have to forgive some things and do a lot more 1 Corinthians 13. We have to love some people and love them well. And I don't know, I think Murray City is a pretty good microcosm for those things. We're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and we have a long way to go, but we sure are trying.
Well, that's great. I think it's a great note to end on. Thank you, Pastor Mike, for being here. Thanks for Mike and Nicole, and we'll be back in a few minutes. So earlier this year, baseball slugger Shohei Ohtani signed a $700 million contract with the Los Angeles Dodgers, making him the biggest star in the game and creating worldwide headlines. But just before the season started, news broke out that money from Shohei Ohtani's accounts had ended up in the hands of a bookie in Los Angeles, where sports gambling is still illegal, leading to questions of whether or not he had gambled. Now, it turns out that it's likely that his interpreter had been doing the gambling, and it's unclear whether Otani knew about this.
So I never bet on baseball or any other sports, or never have asked somebody to do it on my behalf. And I have never went through a bookmaker to bet on sports.
He says he doesn't. The interpreter says he did. Now there's going to be a plea bargain, but it's a big question of like this connection between sports gambling and the leagues themselves, because the irony of this is that baseball has a partnership with sports booking, and leagues that we used to hate gambling and said it would be the end of the world have now embraced them. And sports gambling has become ubiquitous. If you can't watch a game without getting the betting line, even the announcers talking about it. And last year, Americans spent $119 billion on gambling, and $1 billion on the Super Bowl alone. So let's talk about this bit. I actually want to start with Mike because I know he's a Colts fan and likes sports. Why should we care that this is going on?
You know, in the history of gaming in the United States, every time a new initiative comes on the ballot, politicians who get behind it you get a lot of grandiose promises. We're going to tax the heck out of it, and it's going to fix the schools, and it's going to fix the infrastructure, and we're going to beef up our entitlement programs, and it's just everybody's going to flourish because of what we do with the gambling and gaming. And consistently, that never seems to actually quite happen. The schools don't necessarily they might get more funding, but usually not as much as is promised. The infrastructure doesn't get fixed. And what you find instead is that a lot of money ends up getting funneled into drug and alcohol treatment programs, gambling addiction treatment programs, and various other issues that emerge. The fact is that gambling is a highly addictive thing, particularly when you're talking about the kind of gambling that goes with online gambling, sports betting, this kind of stuff where it's quick turn, where there's a video game style dopamine hit that comes along with it. And the other thing that has been demonstrated time and time again is that economically speaking, these are predatory. This is a tax on the poor because that's who they market to, and that's who most often comes and spends money that they can't afford to lose on the gaming. I read a great article the other day by a scholar named Jordan Baller. He'd written it for the Acton Institute. And he says, there's three considerations. If you look historically at the church and how the church has talked about, casting lots and gaming and games of chance and all of this kind of stuff, there's three things that are always come up. One is love of neighbor. Two is seduction, this idea that we're promising something that we ultimately can't deliver on. And three is kind of the idea of skill. Like, are you actually earning money? And so, and Baller even says, like, look, a bunch of friends sitting around a table playing a poker game where everybody can afford to lose whatever they walked in the door with, that's a very different thing than casino gaming and this kind of online gaming and all that. Like, there's room for distinctions, there's room for conscience and all of this. I'm not making an argument that would be all gambling is bad at all times. But as sort of a public policy matter with this kind of gaming that markets to people who can't afford to lose that kind of money, it's profoundly predatory. And to me, this Shohei Ohtani story, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like, you make this kind of gaming available, anonymous, etc. I mean, what could possibly go wrong with our professional sports?
It's that the leagues have betting partners. So actually the NBA is thinking about suspending a player for life for betting on games. The NBA has two official gaming partners. Like, the league is taking the money from the betting, but then telling its players, if you bet, this is a lifetime cardinal sin. But we'll take all the cash. The University of Alabama baseball coach got fired last year for giving insider information, telling somebody else that player was hurt, so bet on against our team, and then he's suspended for 15 years. But there's just really this kind of disconnect, right? Like, the game itself, the integrity of the game is really at risk because of this.
It broke my heart to see that players are harassed by people who have bet against them or bet for them. We know there's not a lot of sympathy for players because they make millions of dollars in many cases. However, To know that some person goes and bets whatever little bit of money that they have and they lose it, all of a sudden, psychologically, it's not just I lost money on a game. It's that player cost me.
One of the real concerns about this is the amount of destruction that it causes. So not a lot of people are problem gamblers, but if you're problem gamblers, it destroys your life. One of the early stories I did years ago was a guy, was a church elder who was going, this is before smartphones, but when we had cell phones, he was going into the bathroom during the offering. He'd collect the offering, then he'd go in the bathroom and call his bookie to get set down thing. Well, he lost everything. And in fact, he ended up robbing banks to cover his gambling losses, right? Destroyed his whole life. You know that a certain amount of people's lives will be destroyed by promoting this. And then you have the game being a problem. The leagues and broadcasters who promote these things and take the money are playing with fire, it feels like. Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, would talk about like the apocalyptic effects of sports gambling 10 years ago. And now it's like, this is awesome. The apocalypse is awesome. We got all this money.
Years and years ago, I used to work this first shift coffee shop job. I was a pastor at the time and bivocational. And we'd, in the spring, I live in Louisville, we've got Churchill Downs down the road. Churchill Downs would have these spring meets. Admission was free, $1 hot dogs. So we'd get off work at like 11:30 and we'd go down there and we'd get hot dogs and gamble away our tips. We'd walk in with 40, 50 bucks and bet on horses. And me and this one friend in particular went a lot and got to know some of the old timers, and they taught us how to read the card and kind of understand the game. A few weeks in, we got pretty good. And I'll never forget, I went in one morning, maybe I had like 40 bucks in my pocket from tips that morning. And I walked out with a sizable amount of money, having had several races go well and several horses come in, like more than I would normally make in a month. I'll just put it that way. And I sat down in the car and I looked at my friend and I go, I can never go back. And he was like, what? What are you talking about? And I was like, I'm telling you right now, I think I know what I'm doing right now. And if I go back, I will ruin my life. I felt it. I felt the draw. I felt the money for nothing feeling. I felt the power of it. It's an incredible drug. Now, I've been back and I've not ruined my life on gambling or anything like that. But I think that's the power of it, that, when you have the win, it's not like people bet on games and then they just lose $300 or $400. Like, you win and you lose and you win and you lose. It's the ones that work for you that keep you coming back. It's an enormously seductive thing. And I think for a lot of outside observers who are kind of casual observers, like I've heard pastors say, I think gambling is fine. It's an idiot tax. And if you want to lose your money on it or whatever, things that they wouldn't say about other addictions in people's lives that are so powerful.
Is this another sense of institutional failure? So one thing that's happened in our politics is institutional failure, where people who know better have decided to become partisans and forget this, we should get along, forget we should tell the truth. In that case, it's institutional failure in the stakes are so high, we can't believe in this Jesus thing. We got to do whatever it takes. In this case, it's institutional failure. Like, there are gatekeepers who knew better. So Laura Everett, who's a pastor in Massachusetts, head of the Massachusetts Council of Churches, I talked to her about this issue. And she said the sports leagues didn't complain. They just rolled over and said, rub our belly. Right. So gatekeepers, people who should have known better, have decided that the money is too good. Right. The benefit is too high. And if people get destroyed in the process, we don't care. So is this another, am I reaching too far there?
See, I don't think that's a far reach, because in our context, in my community, the issue is the lottery. So you have a very poor communities, urban communities, they can barely put food on the table, but when they go to the grocery store or the corner store, they're going to buy what they need and they're going to put that dollar in, because you never know if your money hits. I have heard pastors in some of these communities say, well, as long as you tithe off of what you get, then it's okay. And I think the money ties cannot be ignored. I think this is an issue of letting pastors off the hook for talking about sin. Now, maybe this is my ultra kind of like, hellfire and brimstone part, but they're not talking about gambling because they're not talking about sin. So I can't reconcile who to blame. And that's the hard part in gambling. Who do you blame?
I think the other side of it is that we're in kind of a libertine cultural moment where pastors don't want to be Ned Flanders wagging their finger and saying, don't do this, don't do that. I mean, you've seen it. And there's data on this. You've seen a much more permissive culture around alcohol and a much higher incidence of alcoholism among evangelicals than ever before. It's the same kind of spirit here. I think people are like, oh, I don't want to be a fuddy-duddy. And then I think the other thing is, I'm not sure I expected myself to say fuddy-duddy on the bulletin. I don't even know where that came from. Part of the libertine thing too is that we don't operate with wisdom and we don't entrust our people with wisdom. We don't entrust them to be able to follow an argument that I think is a little complex. Because if you just get up and say, well, all gambling is sin, they go, well, if I have a bet with my friend where we bet a steak dinner over this or that or the other, like, is that a sin? It's like, no, of course that's not a sin, right? But what we're talking about is an economic institution that is by its nature predatory, whose track record, whose 100-year history in the United States as a legal institution is impoverishing the poor, addicting people, tearing lives apart. That's an argument that's like, I don't have chapter and verse for you, but I have a lot of chapter and verse for you on caring for the poor, caring for the orphan, caring for the widow, and for matters of justice and economic impoverishment.
What's interesting to me is that the two markets that the sports leagues want to get into that they aren't into are Texas and California. Both of them are like, I don't think so, because they're worried about other states, which is fascinating. It's like, maybe we can't get along with politics, but on sports gambling, those two states are pretty pronounced. But it sort of takes some of those states to get up and say, wait a sec, I don't know about this. It's not so great.
Anytime I think about the baseball side of this in particular, the thing that makes me roll my eyes is that they do get in bed with the gaming organizations. They do have this libertine permissive attitude, and Pete Rose is still not in the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame,
right? So, yes, exactly. It's this, we're gonna bar you. We're gonna treat you as pariahs if you do this thing, but we're also gonna have our hand out to take all this money. I will say we're just about done. I want to tell you my favorite story about betting is that in 1987, the Patriots, my home team, the team that I love, was playing the Bears, and they had rolled through the playoffs. They had squished the fish. They beat the Dolphins. I had the Squish the Fish t-shirt, and their coach was named Barry. So they had these shirts called Barry the Bears, and I ran my mouth in Chicago as a college freshman in Chicago about how my Patriots were going to beat those Bears, and I bet money, which I had, but almost all of it on my team, which was the stupidest thing ever, and they got crushed.
Ever.
And I was like, never again. So I never have bet again.
Bob, I just got to tell you, it warms my heart that you would end with a story in which the Patriots lose.
You can't bet with your heart.
Yep.
Well, thanks for being with us. It was great, and we'll be right back.
Hey, Mike. Hi, Chris. I am so glad to be with you today. I've been particularly grateful, Mike, for your work on our limited series podcast, Promised Land, because it's given me a chance to get a sense of the larger story that surrounds the conflict here. And I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to hear from voices who have spent a lot of years embedded in this process, one of whom is Dr. Chris Bauman, our guest for today. Dr. Bauman has worked inside the Israel-Palestine peace process, and so he has a really great view of where we have come from and where we're headed. This last week, the Israelis struck 7 humanitarian aid workers from the World Central Kitchen, which is an NGO run by celebrity chef Jose Andres.
We were outraged to learn of an IDF strike that killed a number of civilian humanitarian workers yesterday from the World Central Kitchen, which has been relentless in working to get food to those who are hungry in Gaza and, quite frankly, around the world. We send our deepest condolences to their families and loved ones. We've seen the comments from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from the Israeli Defense Forces about their commitment to conduct an investigation.
I think for a lot of people, both within Israel and in the global community, this moment has been the straw that broke the camel's back. Folks are just tired. We've hit the 6-month mark and we want no more war. We see President Biden's attempts so far to influence Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's been largely ineffective. And now Biden has come out with some really blistering critique of where Israel stands. But we're supposed to be allies. We're supposed to listen to each other and work together. And I wonder, Dr. Bauman, having worked in the peace process for so many years, has this always been a tension with how we relate to each other, Israel and the U.S., or do you see that something has shifted over time?
Hey, thanks for having me. And let me just, at the very beginning, just throw out any views that I share are my own. They are not intended to represent any views of the U.S. government or the Department of Defense or anything like that. So this is just me. We are in a new moment. It really is unprecedented in our relationship with Israel. For the longest time, it didn't matter whether you were Democrat or Republican. If you were in Congress, you were racing your fellow members to the microphone to declare more strongly how supportive you were of Israel. That began to change a little bit with the visit of Netanyahu in 2015 at the invitation of Speaker Boehner. They bypassed the White House and President Obama at the time, which is a pretty huge diplomatic insult. And that began to show some cracks in the foundation. That has accelerated in some ways. It was fairly stable under the Trump administration, mostly because President Trump went along with pretty much everything Israel wanted to do. But the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, pushed back on some of the things that Israel has done, including this latest conflict. And Israel generally doesn't like that, as you can imagine. There's been multiple occasions of leaders going all the way back to at least to George H.W. Bush saying, we need you to stop on settlements, we need you to stop on this or that. And the Israelis basically don't respond. They'll just ignore that. The difference now is that you see within Congress, again, going back to 2015 and forward, that there's not universal support for Israel on both sides the way there was. And I think that that's opened up some space to push harder. Friends don't let friends drive drunk. Both President Biden and President Obama are strong supporters of Israel. They really are, but they see that the actions that they're taking are making them a pariah in the international community. And so they're literally trying to steer them back off that course.
Mike, do you think they're doing a good job?
One of the things you've seen with Biden in the last 6 months is that he's had this sort of two-step where Biden and his spokespeople will go before cameras and say, we're really putting the pressure on Bibi, and we want Israel to make sure that there's a lot of humanitarian aid, and we want to resolve this, and we want to resolve that, and they've got to put these things together. But then policy-wise, the policy is free-flowing defense aid and money as needed. That's been very consistent up until, I would say, the last week, where it's the first time, and again, he hasn't cut off the aid yet, but it's the first time where the threat of cutting off the aid had some more teeth to it. And again, I think, like you pointed out at the beginning here, that was largely due to the reaction to the deaths of the World Central Kitchen workers. Within a couple of days, Israel begins to pull basically all but, I think, one brigade out of Gaza at that point. And one of the interesting things and one of the frustrating things following the war is that Israel doesn't always explain their actions. So there's a lot of like competing narratives as to why they pulled out. I think I understand what Biden is trying to do. He's trying to manage an internal coalition here in the States and support the ally at the same time. Will it work? I don't know. Whatever he gains by appearing tough on Israel in the States, he simultaneously loses by the sense that the world is unstable and that we're not a reliable ally. And you saw that today. I mean, the first time Trump has really commented on Biden's policy towards Israel was today. He walked up to a group of cameras and he goes, look at this. He's abandoning Israel. He's weak on the Middle East. The world is in chaos.
Trump brought us the Abraham Accords, right? And Jared Kushner, who was the special advisor at the time, called it the beginning of the end. This was going to be the end of the Israel-Arab conflict. So what happened?
That was actually pretty easy in the sense that, and I was no longer at the White House when that happened, but I was very much against those particular agreements, specifically because just like the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 79, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty of 94, they bypassed the Palestinian issue in the Abraham Accords. And it leaves this thing at the core of the conflict that makes life horrible for Palestinians and for Israelis both. It causes the suffering just to go on and on. I'm not any great fan of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, but the thing that he has done really well was insist that he would not allow Saudi Arabia to enter an agreement with Israel unless it included some kind of commitment to a two-state outcome for the Palestinians. That was under serious negotiation just last summer, and then the October 7th attacks happened. Some speculate that maybe that was part of why Hamas attacked, was to try to disrupt that process. I have no idea. But until we deal with that core issue, life is going to continue to be miserable for both Israelis and Palestinians.
We focus all the time on the Israel-Palestine relationship, and rightly so. But the other part of the relationship is Palestine and all of the Arab neighbors, and the sense that many Palestinians feel that they have been time and time again abandoned and or betrayed by those neighbors. So there's a sense in which I think the Abraham Accords fit that narrative. I'm probably more sympathetic to the idea of the Accords as a step towards something healthier happening for the Palestinian people. Part of what seems to be the core issue to me is a culture gap. And I think this is something that gets lost a lot in the global conversation around this, that there's a serious culture gap where we often look at this and think in terms of sort of Western liberal values. And yet what we're dealing with is the world of the Middle East. As one source that I talked to in the West Bank talked about it, it's a world of like family, tribe, symbol, and stories, right? With much more than it is about liberal values or rational values or sort of political exchange, transactional exchange. Transaction isn't terribly interesting when power and symbol is much more centrally important. Part of the reason the Abraham Accords could even happen is because Saudi Arabia and the Emirates basically said, we're going to root out radicalism in our own countries. And they did that in a way that was ugly and brutal, but they did it, and it's led to all kinds of political normalization, not just with Israel, but with the broader world. There's no mechanism for that with the Palestinians. There's no will for it, certainly not among the Palestinian Authority leaders. And in Gaza, the radicals are in charge. So how does that process even begin? How does a culture shift even begin?
It's incredibly difficult. There's absolutely no question about it. And none of the folks that work on this long-term have any grand illusions about how simple this will be going forward. My core argument has always been that there's only one way out of this, and that's towards some kind of a two-state outcome. But the only way you're going to get there is by first embracing the current narratives of both sides, not just one, and then changing that narrative over time. You can't understand the actions of the Israeli government. You can't understand the attitudes of the Israeli public unless you understand the Israeli narrative, that the Holocaust is a real thing, and it's not something that happened 75 years ago. It's something that is like right there. It's present, and that the October 7th attacks re-traumatized Israeli society. Likewise, on the Palestinian side, you can't understand what they're doing, and they are many different things. They're not just Hamas. And there's no excuse for Hamas, by the way. Absolutely unreservedly condemn everything that they did on October 7th. But you can't understand the context. Explanation is not justification unless you understand the Palestinian narrative, which looked like the Nakba. When the 750,000, 800,000, whatever it was, Palestinians left, they were fleeing the Haganah, they were fleeing the Arab armies that were invading. For whatever reason they fled, when the armistice happened in 49, they said, okay, let's go back. And the Israeli government said no. And that single decision made two things instantly true. It made it possible to have a Jewish democratic state, which up to that point was sort of just theoretical, and it created the Palestinian refugee crisis at the same time. And we're still living with that today. You're mentioning the Trump administration. One of the difficulties there was that, Jerry's idea was we can solve this all through kind of Western economic issues. Let's build an awesome economy in the West Bank and eventually in Gaza, and everybody will forget about what happened and it'll be great. And we knew that was never going to happen because these things run so deeply. You just can't overcome that. So my argument is until leaders both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, as well as the support from the Americans, from the Arab states, from Europeans, until they embrace both narratives equally and understand them, appreciate them, and then take seriously the idea of reconciliation, we're just going to be stuck in this and we'll just repeat this cycle over and over and over. So how do you change that narrative? I think it begins with, this commitment that everybody's looking for to a two-state outcome. And then you begin to give Palestinians hope that something's actually changing, which has never been there. We're talking about the occupation, removing checkpoints, removing deep settlements that have no business being there, and change what life is like. Then Palestinians could, in theory, go, wow, this is actually something new. That would signal to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to all the other potential partners that something is different now. And if you give them that hope, that's the only way that we begin to move forward into something that could actually be sustainable.
Do we have to wait until the war is over? Benny Gantz has called for early elections in September. More than 70% of Israelis want Netanyahu gone now. Would that be a first step? Is it time for Bibi to step down? And if he does, is that a step forward?
I think it would be a huge signal. And, this current government is never going to enter into anything like a two-state agreement. They just won't do it. So it does require a change in leadership for that to even be a possibility.
But the other thing is, Bibi's never going to step down. I think that's
Correct.
What makes it so difficult because, like you said, if he took a step towards a two-state solution, which he's paid lip service to at times in his career, more recently not. But let's say he did, he'd immediately lose his right flank and the government would collapse. He's not going to step down because if he steps down, he opens himself, I think, back up to some of the criminal prosecutions and things that being in office protects him from. Plus, I think like a lot of political leaders, Netanyahu genuinely believes he's the man of the hour to kind of fix all of this. It's hard to envision a situation where an early election happens unless through the circumstances of the war or other kinds of compromises, his coalition does actually fall apart, which would take that right wing collapsing or the ultra-Orthodox Jews that are part of the coalition leaving the coalition. And there's some political winds right now that could cause that to happen as well. But I do think that would be for the best. I think for there to be any kind of movement towards a political solution, he does have to go.
I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Iran, because this week it was reported that they're smuggling weapons into the West Bank. Are they capitalizing on this unease that exists right now? Do you have a sense that this is going to become a new flashpoint in the Middle East?
I would say that, as of the afternoon of October 7th, beginning of October 8th, I wasn't there, but probably the number one goal of the Biden administration was to keep Hezbollah out, keep Iran out, because that does raise the stakes to an existential level for Israel. The smuggling of stuff into the West Bank is concerning because of the volume. It sounds like that's been happening, but it's nothing new. The IRGC has been doing that kind of stuff forever. They are the supplier for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. I'm sure if you traced it backwards, if that were possible, you'd find Tehran's fingerprints on all the weapons that Hamas used in the attacks. And since Israel's able to intercept a lot of those kinds of shipments and have done so pretty regularly, but obviously some stuff gets through. So it's a concern, but I don't think it's new.
I do think it's interesting that it's heated up in the last week and that the news of it has heated up. I mean, there's reasons that stuff gets reported and gets leaked in the timing that it does. And I don't think it's any coincidence that when 50 members of Congress sign a letter saying it's time to stop funding the war, when Biden says we're going to get much tougher on this, we might have to cut you off and all of this, very quickly, you then start seeing a more aggressive posture from Iran, a more aggressive posture from Hezbollah and all of that. And I think the two are absolutely related. And I also have a general sense of confidence that were something to actually escalate there, America would be there as a partner. I mean, Biden made a very strong statement to that effect today, that nothing would be tolerated. At the same time, they've tolerated an awful lot. I mean, there have been a lot of rockets fired from Hezbollah. There's 75,000 people who were evacuated from their homes in the north since October the 7th. They have not gone home yet because they're anticipating a war on the northern front. And the Houthis have gotten away with a lot. I mean, we've hit them back a bit, but they've gotten away with an awful lot. There's a whole lot of belligerence that's been tolerated for a very long time. I think what you would see as an Israeli response to a direct attack from Iran would be pretty terrifying, as I understand it. And who knows how that would light things up globally.
Yeah, the challenge with Hezbollah is, Hamas, first of all, was far more capable than anybody had guessed. I got it. But Hezbollah is 10, 20, 30 times more capable than that because there's an easy direct line, relatively speaking, from Iran through Syria, Lebanon. So Hezbollah has hundreds of thousands by now, rockets, missiles, and mortars of increasing range and capacity and accuracy, and it would completely overwhelm the Israeli missile defense system. So that's why you don't see anybody getting excited about, oh yeah, let's light off the north. That'll be great. That would be horrible. And so we're trying to avoid that at all costs.
As I was watching the news over the weekend, I saw an interview with Nir Barkat, the former mayor of Jerusalem. He was interviewed on MSNBC and really just raked over the coals by Joe Scarborough, had fumbled a lot on how he was going to describe what was happening in Israel, how he could defend his government. And one line he repeated over and over really stuck with me. He kept saying that Hamas needed to be eliminated from the face of the earth. And, that's language that we've heard Hamas use about Israel from the river to the sea. And I wonder if we could, for a moment in closing, take our political hats off and just think Christianly about our language. Certainly, we know that those who do harm to people made in the image of God need to receive justice. But in a time where Americans in particular are so polarized, from protests on college campuses to signs in people's front yards, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, is there something that should be distinctively Christian about the way we talk about our enemies in the midst of conflict?
I think it's one of the most important questions we could ponder. I guess I'd start with this. Some interviews were done with student protesters as they're chanting from the river to the sea, and they were asked, do you know what river we're talking about? What sea you're talking about? And they're like, I don't know, Mississippi, Baltic? I'm not really sure. So there's super
Mississippi
thin.
to the Baltic is a massive
big
territory.
Area. It's a big area. There's a super thin understanding of the narratives, right? And if you ask many American Christian Zionists, why do you support Israel? It's about the same depth. It's, well, my pastor said that those who stand with Israel stand on the side of God. Okay, but there's a lot more to it. And so I think if, Jesus made it pretty clear, love your enemies. It doesn't get a lot more clear than that. I think if we deepen understanding as much as we can on both sides, so to, again, help people understand both narratives and how powerful this is. We're talking about two populations that are totally traumatized. You're talking about the body keeps the score at a national level. That's happening on both sides. And so bringing into that piece the idea that we can, no kidding, not just talk about it, but actually love our neighbor, that's where the transformation can actually happen. And that's not typically national policy. But I think as the body of Christ, we can absolutely begin to step into that.
Let me agree, but also push on that a little bit.
Sure.
Because when I hear the phrase Hamas has to be eliminated, right? When I talk to Israelis about that kind of language and about this war, what they want, particularly the ones who lived in that Gaza envelope or the ones living in Sderot and Ashkelon and these nearby cities, they want to be able to go to bed at night and not wake up with Hamas terrorists in their front yard banging down the door. And October 7th revealed to them that they have no reason to have any confidence that that's the case. So the elimination of Hamas as a threat, as a military organization, a terror organization, is what they're primarily concerned with. A government has a covenantal duty with its citizens to let them sleep safe at night, right? But I say that to say that I'm less judgmental of the rhetoric, because I think if this were happening on our doorstep, we would be saying the government has a duty to bear the sword. That's where I'm less hesitant to be critical there, even as I think the ultimate goal of a peaceful two-state vision is the thing I'd love to see as well. I'm with you as well on the complexity of it. I don't know how that begins without that fundamental culture shift.
So you're absolutely right. It's the most basic responsibility of any state to provide security for its citizens. If you can't do that, then, are you really a state? The challenge is that the way in which you provide that security might make it better or worse. And so, people talk about the cycles of violence, and if we could just break the cycle, everything will be great. But the problem is that the structure of the conflict, not the cycles, but the structure just causes the cycles to repeat over and over and over. And if we put a Band-Aid on this one, call it good, we're done, it's just going to repeat again, a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever. And so you have to fundamentally change the structure of the conflict. And that's why, we have no illusions that Palestinians and Israelis are going to intermix and love each other anytime soon. You're going to have a physical separation for a while, and it may take a generation or two before you can have actual reconciliation between peoples. But until you change the structure, it's just going to continue. And, people ask me, how can you talk about a peace process when this horrible thing just happened? And my answer is, well, the reason this horrible thing just happened is because we refuse to take a peace process seriously. And if you look into the details of every process that's happened all the way back, there are narratives out there about how, it was always the fault of one side or the other. And I think President Obama said it best, nobody's hands are clean in all of this. And so taking a deep breath, understanding that, and engaging in ways that could actually change the structure. And man, is it hard. I get it. It's going to take a long time, but that's the only way forward.
Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. That's our model, right? Thank you, Dr. Bauman, so much for joining us. And Mike, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. We'd love to hear from you for our upcoming mailbag episode. Send us your questions at podcasts@christianitytoday.com or tag Christianity Today on X and leave your question with the hashtag #AskTheBulletin. We look forward to hearing from you.
The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper. It's produced by Clarissa Mall and Matt Stevens. Post-production by TJ Hester. Our art for this episode is by Rick Shooks. Music by Dan Phelps. And social media by Kate Lucky. Thanks for listening.